Hi, this is Xing. I am an assistant professor of interaction and media design at Parsons.
Hi, I'm Catherine Moriwaki, Associate Professor of Media Design at Parsons.
And this week in Critical Computation, we are going to talk about classes, objects, and inheritance. First, we're going to talk about what classes and objects are through a technical perspective in programming. So using our class, the CC lecture, as an example, a class is essentially a blueprint. So if we think about, as a metaphor, CC lecture as a blueprint, every single year when we run this class and rerun this class, these different instances of CC lecture are the objects. So classes are blueprint and objects are instances of that blueprint. Inside a class, there are something called attributes. So I might, create and customize the attribute for CC lecture by saying, hey, no matter what, the blueprint of the CC lecture is going to have 15 weeks. It's going to contain 15 lectures. It's going to have 15 readings. It's going to have 10 assignments, 1 midterm, and everybody's going to make a CC portfolio. But every single instance of this class, so every time when CC lecture run, we might tweak the details of these attributes a little bit, right? So the lecture might change slightly, or the readings might change slightly, the assignment might be slightly different, and all the different little detail we can possibly tweak exists and take place in objects. And this is where we are going to dive in to thinking about hierarchical relationship in programming and how that translates into the way societies are thought of historically in a hierarchical way, and how those two things feed back and forth to each other. And towards the end, we'll show you games and simulation that manifest how things become a feedback loop. This diagram that you see here shows the feudal system in the medieval England. There are many actually different kinds of feudal system in different countries, both in the West and the East, and they all function quite differently. But kind of a clear common characteristic of a feudal system is the clear, distinct separation of class. And also oftentimes how one's class is deeply tied to one's fate that's assigned at birth. So if you are a shoemaker's children, you might be born into a shoemaker business and you will grow up to be a shoemaker. And the same with, being born into a royalty family versus, a peasant's family. And it's these scenarios of what happens when you're born into that class can vary depending on the time period or the country, but overall there is a sense of clear distinction and a taboo of crossing classes. I think it's interesting a lot of times when historians declare feudalism starts from here and it ends there, and now we're in capitalism, and these kind of like very clear perception of when a system begins and when a system ends, in reality doesn't always happen in such a clean-cut way, right? So a lot of times systems coexist and they sort of find ways to organically grow into each other. So in this case, what you're seeing here is a comparison between medieval feudalism versus corporate feudalism. That feudal system actually very much relied on the top 1% protecting each other and granting land and property to each other in exchange for military protection or protection of the border, and how that kind of translates into thinking about corporate feudalism and the kind of protection different layers of the corporate top 1% might provide to each other in order for that system and power to stay in place?
So in the United States, we often like to believe that we have this thing called social mobility. Social mobility, which is defined as the movement of individuals, families, households, or other categories of people within or between social strata in a society. It's a change in social status relative to one's current social location within a given society. So the American dream, as we like to call it, right? The idea that people can come to the United States and no matter where they're from or how much money they have when they arrive, that through hard work, a person can go from having nothing to having enormous amounts of wealth. There is this belief within the United States that this is something that's possible for everybody, and yet social mobility is really heavily constrained by race, gender, and an assumption basically of able-bodiedness. And so this is a interesting project by the artist Pope L. And it's a series of works basically that he has been creating since the late 70s on through the 90s, and they're called crawls. And this is one instance of that work from 1991. And what he did was crawl around Tompkins Square Park wearing a business suit. And this project is really kind of evocative, if you will. In his words, Pope L was saying, by giving up his verticality during his crawls, that he was prompting spectators to direct their gaze downward, drawing attention to the people who exist in vulnerable positions on the street and in society. His suit underscored the deep rift between aspirations of upward mobility and the absence of opportunity that confronts many Americans. So this idea of social mobility actually is one that is easily contested and disputed as to whether or not, in fact, this achievability of the American dream is realistic or not. So this is a survey that was conducted by Michelle Millar Fisher and Art Museum Transparency to take a look at unpaid internships in the museum field. This spreadsheet actually recorded what a person had to do, what kind of responsibilities they had, whether or not those responsibilities were actually contributing to learning and growth in their profession, and then ultimately how much that intern got paid, what kind of compensation were they receiving, and what their actual expenses were. And what this does is begin to paint a very clear picture of how difficult it is actually for someone who doesn't already have means to be able to participate in the unpaid internship economy. And this is really part of a drive to eliminate the unpaid internship, not only because of unethical labor practice, the unethical labor practice associated with unpaid internships, but also because of the ways in which unpaid internships support ultimately social inequality through favoring individuals who have the financial means to be able to literally work for free in order to establish connections and professional relationships. So this leads us to the myth of the meritocracy and the American dream. I mentioned before the American dream and what that actually means for people when they hear it. Again, it's usually associated with this idea that anybody can achieve financial and material success if they are simply going to work hard enough. And therefore, anybody who actually has material and financial success has it because they deserved it. And that is the myth of meritocracy, this idea that people are rewarded based off of merit regardless of what kind of circumstances a person came from, that hard work and talent will be recognized basically with material success.
Yes, and so alongside with American Dream, this phrase, pull yourself by your own bootstrap, is a common phrase in the American political discourse, particularly in reference to self-reliance and how just by simply working hard and relying on yourself, you can go towards the path of success without anyone's help and without a safety net. The story of Bill Gates essentially became a billionaire like in his parents' garage is one of those stories that had really recycled so many times through different forms of media, including Hollywood films, that really solidified this idea of pulling yourself up by your own bootstrap, and that notion that you do not need a safety net. One does not need extra help from relatives or friends or the society in order to get to a place of success. And this has its flip side, because the kind of toxic aspect of this phrase, pulling yourself up by your own bootstrap, is also the implication that if you are not in a place of success, or if you're running into obstacles in life, it is your fault that you are not working hard enough or trying hard enough.
This is a comic strip from Dilbert, which in the US is a comic strip about sort of, I guess, the drudgery of professional office life. But it's very insightful, actually, in terms of identifying those contradictions inherent within the corporate workplace, or any kind of office workplace for that matter. But here, the comic says, "May I ask some questions about your journey to success?" And the boss says, "I don't like the sound of this." And then, his subordinate worker says, "I'm trying to ascertain what percentage of a person's success is pure luck. For example, who hired you for your first real job?" And the boss says, "Well, my dad, but in my defense, I interview very well," which I think is just a great example, if you will, of the degree to which individuals are oftentimes either naively unaware of their own privilege, or many times more menacingly are sort of very willingly ignorant of the various levels of privilege and support that have bolstered their success. And so this is actually a really interesting example with Kylie Jenner, who was declared by Forbes as a self-made billionaire, which actually didn't take into account the fact that Kylie Jenner comes from a family of privilege with enormous amounts of material comfort, as well as a high-profile role in or high profile a high degree of cultural visibility as a fashion model. It's really fascinating when somebody says that somebody is a self-made billionaire. What exactly do they actually mean by self-made? It's evident that Kylie Jenner didn't have to start from a position of lacking social privilege. And it's also evident that Kylie's own family background was very much a part of, maybe not the only reason for success, but certainly a very large contributing factor. And we see this kind of narrative actually play out with a lot of tech industry titans as well. Jeff Bezos, for example, his parents, gave him close to $250,000 to start Amazon in 1995. And his parents were able to provide him with that seed funding for his company, full well knowing that they had, according to Jeff, Mr. Bezos, that there was a 70% chance that they wouldn't receive their investment back. Now, obviously, that investment, the funds that they invested in Jeff Bezos's company have obviously returned back, countless times over. But simply the fact that his parents had the degree of disposable income to be able to invest in a startup is notable and striking, especially when Jeff Bezos then is touted as a quote unquote self-made billionaire, multi-billionaire several times over. And so this leads us to a sort of canon example of new media net art by Josh On from 2001, titled They Rule, which was a data visualization that showed the individuals who sit on major corporations and individuals who sit on the boards of major corporations and how tightly interconnected those networks of power actually are. So you can follow a single individual and see what other corporate boards they sit on. And very soon it becomes apparent that this network of board members is very, very tightly interconnected, that people sit on multiple corporate boards, and that in fact, actually, there is an aggregation of power and influence amongst a very, very small number of people who have an outsized influence in terms of business, the direction of resources, and the generation of wealth.
And here is another data visualization that came out of this website called littlesis.org that I highly recommend checking out. It is a website that's specifically created for mapping out how the powerful connects to each other. And there's actually a tool that you can use, and you can try to create your own chart as well. But this specific chart that we're looking at is a map of all the different parties that have been involved and have been profited from the production of tear gas that is used by the police during protest to discipline the protesters. And when we take a more careful look at who are the investors of tear gas in the United States, we very soon will find museums, performing art centers, and music festivals, and different venues that on the surface present itself as being sympathetic towards the protesters, are actually like benefiting from the police state and benefiting from the oppression of protesters. So here what we see is America through two different angles. The one on the left, American socialism, only really apply to the top 1%. We see a lot of free premiums, services, and an exchange of values that is very much contained within the bubble of the 1%, where if you look at the depiction on the right, what we see is very little wiggle room of what happens when something breaks. A tight control and schedule of mortgages and debts and different ways of extraction that simultaneously is coupled with the messages of the American dream. If we're falling behind, it must be because we're not working hard enough, right? So these kind of like two simultaneous operation between the rich and the average is quite stark in the United States.
Depending on a person's life circumstances and the circumstances of their parents or their grandparents. Certain conditions and experiences and opportunities present themselves, or in some cases, even intentional barriers. And this really impacts the degree to which individuals are able to achieve economic stability or even great financial success. And so what we end up seeing really is a system which is presented as changeable. We're given a myth about American society as creating opportunity for social mobility, or an American society which rewards hard work and merit. But in the end, there are real systems at play that actually limit opportunity for some and generate and provide unlimited opportunity for others. When Jamie Johnson was 23 years old and still in film school, he went around and interviewed a number of his friends or people in his social circle and asked them to basically talk about money, which within this particular social strata of individuals, the extremely wealthy, the obscenely wealthy, for that matter, is something that is actually very, very taboo. Extremely wealthy people do not like talking about how much money they actually have. Some of that is that it's considered vulgar or tacky, but some of it also is that if a person has to talk too much about their wealth, then inevitably the question of where that wealth comes from comes up. And in many cases, when it comes to individuals who are extremely wealthy at this particular strata, as one of the previous slides showed, oftentimes they're making their money off of very questionable either business practices, labor practices, or questionable industries with which to make money, like, for example, tear gas.
And a huge part of how rich become richer or maintain rich is really through tactics or strategies of tax evasion, right? And tax evasion is certainly conversations that's meant to be kept within a tight-knitted circle and not something to necessarily boaster about. And here is another example and a report actually called Dreams Deferred that takes a pretty in-depth look conducted by the Institute for Policy Studies from last year, looking at some details of the wealth gap in the United States, which is also tightly related to intergenerational wealth. Whether someone's family or parents were homeowners or landowners or had stocks or had any sort of properties that they were able to pass on versus not, also attributes to this chart over here. So what we're seeing here is a graph that shows the Black and Latino families that are in fact twice as likely to have zero wealth. So we can see that consistency of how these numbers have like really created a huge distinction and gap that would take a very long time to close between white people in the United States versus Black and Latino populations.
And another thing that's actually driving that wealth gap as well is student loan debt and the cost of higher education. This is actually a graph that shows how much debt in the United States these days is being carried by the general population. And you can really see that loan debt is something that is increasing at in astronomical proportion to all other kinds of debt. And the interesting thing about student loan debt in the United States is that it is impossible to discharge even through bankruptcy. It's the kind of debt that follows a person rather quite morbidly and literally to their grave. And so that brings us to talking about where the source of this intergenerational wealth gap actually comes from. Like, why is it that there is a discrepancy in terms of race, and why is that something that tracks so strongly and is compounded over time? And I think that it is impossible to talk about disparities in wealth without really talking about the foundation of American wealth and the wealth of the United States, which is essentially rooted in capitalism, and a kind of capitalism that relied on slavery. This is an artist, Clementine Hunter. A lot of her work actually depicts life on the plantation, right? Life on a plantation, and the kind of daily life that she would see and experience while essentially living life as a slave. I think that it's impossible to think about the kind of economic growth that the United States was able to sustain without acknowledging that so much of that growth was dependent on uncompensated, unacknowledged labor, essentially by Black people who were brought to this country to be treated as objects and a source of wealth extraction. This absolutely set up a kind of racial hierarchy as well as economic hierarchy, which then through, after the Civil War, through the ending of slavery, continued to persist and morph in different kinds of forms. Maybe perhaps a sort of official slavery might have been outlawed, but then at that point, economic policies put into place, social policies put into place, segregation, unequal access to resources, racial prejudice, limiting what kind of jobs people could do and what kind of opportunities they could seek. All of this begins to compound exponentially in order to create a situation where we are today, in the present day.
One of the sources we have looked at is the essay article Capitalism by Matthew Desmond. That's part of the New York Times 1619 project, which examined the legacy of slavery in America. And I just want to add on top of what Catherine has mentioned, to quote Desmond here. So starting quote, "If today America promotes a particular kind of low road capitalism, which refers to a union busting capitalism of poverty wages, gig jobs, and normalized insecurity, a winner take all capitalism of stunning disparities, not only permitting but awarding financial rule bending, a racist capitalism that ignores the fact that slavery didn't just deny Black freedom but built white fortunes, and originating the Black and white wealth gap that annually grows wider." And that is one reason that American capitalism was founded on the lowest road there is. So I think there are, through this articles and different historical evidences, we can also really start thinking about American capitalism as having its own kind of narrative, and a very particular kind that really could not have existed without the extraction of Black labor.
this is a project called Mapping Inequality, Redlining in New Deal America, which actually took the maps generated by the Home Owners Loan Corporation between 1935 and 1940 and has placed them into an interactive map that you can explore basically and look at and view these maps and the data contained within them, which essentially assigned a grade to certain neighborhoods, thereby marking certain neighborhoods as desirable and attractive and other neighborhoods as undesirable and hazardous was the term that was actually used. So this became significant. Again, we mentioned redlining early on in the semester, but we'll bring it up again because this grading actually established whether or not people who lived in those zones were able to secure mortgages for homes. This has enormous implication because one of the main drivers of wealth generation in the United States is home ownership. And so for a lot of people, particularly Black people living in areas that were then deemed quote unquote hazardous, usually for racist motivations, were denied the opportunity to be able to secure home loans, to attain home ownership, and then have access to one of the main drivers of wealth generation in US society.
So we're going to take a slight turn to looking at intergenerational trauma and very much thinking about the kinds of social and economic inequality that took place throughout the history and the kinds of effects it can have on individuals and mental health. And so in this particular slide, this is an example of a therapy practice and theory called the family constellation. Within this practice, it is believed that one approach to start getting closer to examining one's trauma, it's important to look into one's history and chart out how trauma has transferred and relates to each other from one generation to another.
And then what we'd like to do is bring up this concept of post-memory. And so post-memory describes the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before, to experiences they remember only by means of the stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. But these experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and effectively as to seem to constitute memories in their own right. Post-memory's connection to the past is thus actually mediated not by the recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation. To grow up with overwhelming inherited memories, to be dominated by narratives that preceded one's birth or one's consciousness, is to risk having one's own life stories displaced, even evacuated by our ancestors. It is to be shaped, however, indirectly by traumatic fragments of events that still define narrative reconstruction and exceed comprehension. These events happened in the past, but their effects continue into the present. And Marianne Hirsch is the person who coined this term. And it definitely applies to the ways in which artists and designers process their experiences. And it also applies to, I mean, this very much applies to the ways in which people carry these sort of burdens of traumas that their ancestors might have suffered, as well as the societal effects of those traumas and the ways in which those societal effects continue to persist, even when events have happened in the past. This is a project by Kristine Aono, and the title of the project is Deru Kugi Wa Uteru, which translated into English is the nail that sticks up the farthest takes the most pounding. It's a project about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And it was a project that really was intentionally created to process that intergenerational trauma that exists when a group of people are incarcerated, and specifically with the Japanese American community of being racially scapegoated, experiencing forced incarceration, and at the same time being displaced and having one's own very identity, one's Americanness, constantly questioned, and and being placed in this space of kind of racialized scrutiny, which I would say is an experience that isn't at all unique to Japanese Americans in the United States. I think the examples across a range of different both ethnic groups as well as racial groups historically, within the United States, this has been a kind of trauma that is a through line throughout American history, in which the specific brand of American white supremacy that this country traffics in has created and generated trauma with a range of groups of people who then have to reconcile with the after effects of that.
In the next project we are going to show by the artist Kara Walker contains images that depict violence that's enacted on Black bodies. And we wanted to add this content warning here just in case you might want to skip that project over if it makes you feel uncomfortable.
Kara Walker is known for, this particular type of work that explores sex, violence, and slavery. And these intricate silhouettes are very intentionally depicting extreme violence and horror. If anything, I would say that Kara Walker's work is held up as an example of artwork which really addresses that intergenerational trauma with an unflinching and very hard and difficult, and yet at the same time resilient and unyielding look. So this next project investigates poverty and is actually a simulation game to try to generate empathy for individuals who might not have financial resources, and to help people understand what it's really like to experience poverty. This was created by McKinney, which is an advertising design agency for urban ministries of Durham. And through playing this game, you're meant to see how poverty is actually less of a result of poor choices, which is another, the flip side basically of the myth of meritocracy, is that, well, if you work hard and you are talented, then you'll be rewarded financially. And so the flip side to that is that, well, then if you are then not wealthy, or if you're poor, then somehow there must be something wrong with you. There must be something defective. You must not work hard enough, or you must not be talented enough. So this game is meant to counter that myth of meritocracy from the end of examining what it is like to experience poverty. And so as you play this game, you are supposed to go through a series of essentially untenable choices where you have to choose between, for example, eating a healthy meal or potentially paying your electricity bill, or, finding a job and getting a little bit ahead, only to find that one small accident goes ahead and wipes out all of your savings. And that ultimately the margins at which a person who financially struggles are so small and so exacting that everything has to go right, nothing can go wrong, without always at some point being on the edge of financial ruin.
And so this really is helping us shift into thinking about simulation in digital media, and how in order to create simulation, you need to assign attributes to a model that you're hoping to simulate from. And this then really sort of like we're making a loop and circle back into thinking about how do the existing forces and conception of how social hierarchy and economical hierarchy works translate into the way we approach simulation and modelings. So in this case, this piece that is really fun to play, I would highly recommend checking out on Nicky Case's website, called The Parables of the Polygon. It is a game where the scenario is that both the triangles and the squares would be unhappy if they are living among a neighborhood with 1/3 of their neighbors that are like them or are not like them. so in the pursuit of sort of having the right balance of living among people who are like you versus not like you, there's actually this very complex kind of puzzle solving process one has to go through, and it's never really perfect. This actually really reminds me of the kind of very peculiar situation of white hipsters who want to move into a neighborhood, you know, oftentimes that is historically, you know, lived by the Latino population or the Black population. And while once they move into that neighborhood, like hoping to find a cafe or bookstore that is friendly to the white hipsters, right? And that kind of like need and that kind of curious balance of wanting to have diversity, but also wanting enough things that are tailored to the lifestyle of the white hipsters is really interesting, and this is what this simulation reminds me of. What we're seeing here is called The Humans of Simulated New York by Francis Tseng and Fei Liu. And this project actually uses a simulation technique called the agent-based modeling, in which the system is represented by individual agents. And in this case, these are people that have predefined behaviors. So this simulation was based off of the New York Census data. And you can see that the way a character inside, you know, a game space or a space of simulation relies on predefined attributes that very much relates to the classes and objects that we're going to be applying this week. And the outcomes of behavior is oftentimes driven by the kind of attributes that's being assigned to them. In this case, the parameters for the simulation are derived from data. And what this project examines is when a citizen would be successful at finding a job based on the given data, and how structural inequality is being reinforced inside this simulation system.